Hey everyone! Tonight we're drifting back to the Middle Ages. So, if you're already comfortable, let your shoulders relax a little. Dim the lights if you can. Put your phone somewhere slightly too far away to reach without effort. And settle in. Tonight, we're going to spend some quiet time with medieval kings. Not their wars, particularly. Not their castles, not their famous battles, heroic speeches, or carefully painted portraits in which everyone somehow looks considerably cleaner than they probably did in real life. Tonight, we're interested in something much softer. Love. Or, at least, the medieval version of it. Because for a medieval king, falling in love was not necessarily a simple matter of meeting someone, getting along beautifully, and deciding to spend the rest of your life together. A medieval king had responsibilities. There were alliances to arrange, territories to secure, noble families to satisfy, church officials to impress, heirs to produce, and occasionally, somewhere beneath all of that, there was an actual human being with feelings. Which was inconvenient. A king might love someone he could not marry. He might marry someone he did not love. He might marry someone he initially disliked and eventually tolerate. He might marry someone for political reasons and then spend years having a surprisingly complicated emotional life elsewhere. And, naturally, everyone around him would have an opinion. Tonight, we'll begin with one of the most famous examples. Henry II of England. Henry was born in 1133. At a time when England was still recovering from a long and rather exhausting struggle over who exactly was supposed to be king. His mother was Empress Matilda. His father was Geoffrey Plantagenet, Count of Anjou. And from an early age, Henry was surrounded by politics. He inherited lands. He made alliances. He fought wars. He negotiated. He argued. He conquered. He eventually became one of the most powerful rulers in Western Europe. And, like many powerful medieval men, he had a complicated marriage. His wife was Eleanor of Aquitaine. Now, Eleanor was not exactly an unfortunate choice. Quite the opposite. She was one of the most formidable women of the 12th century. She had inherited the enormous duchy of Aquitaine while still very young. She had already been married to Louis VII of France. That marriage had failed spectacularly enough to be remembered for centuries. Then Eleanor married Henry. And suddenly Henry had a wife who was wealthy, politically important, intelligent, experienced, and perfectly capable of having her own opinions. Lots of them. This was not always convenient. The marriage produced children. Among them were Richard the Lionheart and John, who would later become two of the most famous English kings. So from a dynastic point of view, the marriage was extremely successful. Emotionally, however, things became more complicated. Henry was a restless man. He traveled constantly. He hunted. He fought. He managed an enormous collection of territories stretching across England and much of France. He also had a reputation for sexual relationships outside his marriage. This was not especially unusual for medieval kings. It was, however, somewhat more complicated when the king happened to become attached to a woman who was already part of the royal household. Her name was Rosamund Clifford. Rosamund was the daughter of Walter Clifford, a nobleman from the Welsh Marches. We know surprisingly little about her actual life. And this is important, because later generations became absolutely fascinated by Rosamund. They turned her into a legendary beauty. They called her the Fair Rosamund. They invented stories about secret gardens. They imagined elaborate mazes. They pictured jealous queens, poison, hidden rooms, secret meetings. Medieval romance, once it gets going, rarely knows when to stop. But the historical Rosamund is much quieter. She appears to have entered Henry's life sometime in the 1170s. Henry had already been married to Eleanor for many years. And Eleanor was not simply some distant wife living quietly in a castle. She was deeply involved in politics. She had her own lands. She had her own networks. She had sons who were increasingly important. And Henry's family life was becoming difficult. The king and queen had several children, but their relationship had deteriorated badly. By the 1170s, Henry was also facing serious conflicts with his sons. His eldest surviving son, Henry the Young King, had been crowned king during his father's lifetime. This was a common political arrangement in parts of medieval Europe. It was supposed to make succession easier. Instead, it helped create a family dispute that eventually became a rebellion. Because apparently one king was not enough. Henry the Young King wanted more authority. His brothers Richard and Geoffrey had ambitions of their own. Eleanor supported her sons in their conflict with their father. And Henry II, who had spent much of his life building a powerful empire, now found himself fighting members of his own family. It was not exactly a peaceful domestic arrangement. And somewhere in the middle of this complicated royal household was Rosamund. She seems to have been Henry's favored companion for several years. There is evidence that Henry provided for her. She lived at Woodstock, where Henry had a palace. Later tradition associated her with Godstow, near Oxford. And it was there that her story became wrapped in legend. The Romantic version tells us that Henry built a magnificent secret enclosure for Rosamund. Some stories describe an elaborate maze designed so that Eleanor could never find her. Others say that Eleanor eventually discovered the secret. Then came the poison. It is a wonderful story. It is also probably not true. There is no reliable contemporary evidence that Eleanor murdered Rosamund. In fact, the real history is much less theatrical. Rosamund died around 1176. She appears to have entered the convent at Godstow before her death, although the exact circumstances are uncertain. After she died, Henry continued to support the religious community where she had been buried. And Eleanor herself is said to have later intervened regarding Rosamund's burial. But the famous poisoned goblet belongs more to medieval storytelling than solid history. Still, the legend tells us something useful. People were fascinated by the idea of a king who had everything except the freedom to love whom he wanted. Because kingship was a strange thing. A king could command armies. He could issue laws. He could demand taxes. He could punish enemies. He could build castles. He could decide the fate of thousands of people. But he could not necessarily marry the woman he happened to love. Marriage was political, especially at the highest highest levels. For ordinary people, marriage could involve affection, family arrangements, economics, local customs, and personal preference. For a king, marriage could alter the balance of kingdoms. A queen might bring territory. She might bring a claim to a throne. She might connect two dynasties. She might produce children who had legitimate claims to enormous territories. So if a medieval king fell in love with someone unsuitable, there was a problem. The king might simply keep the relationship private. He might establish a household for his companion. He might give her gifts or lands. He might arrange advantageous marriages for their children. But he generally could not pretend that the rules did not exist. Henry II certainly understood those rules. He had married Eleanor because Eleanor was Eleanor of Aquitaine. Her inheritance was enormous. Their marriage joined two powerful political interests. Love may have existed between them at various points, but it was not the reason they married. And this is where medieval royal romance becomes especially interesting. Because love and marriage were not necessarily the same institution. A king could have a wife. He could have children with her. He could respect her political importance. And he could still develop a strong emotional attachment to someone else. This did not make the arrangement healthy. It did not make it fair. And it certainly did not make it peaceful. But medieval society had ways of absorbing such contradictions. The king's mistress could become part of court life. Her family might benefit. Her children might receive positions. Her presence could be quietly tolerated. Sometimes everyone knew what was happening, and everyone simply pretended not to know, which, in royal courts, was apparently considered a perfectly reasonable solution. Henry's relationship with Rosamund seems to have followed some version of this pattern. She was not queen. She did not have Eleanor's political authority. She did not possess the legal position of a wife. Yet she became important enough to be remembered. And perhaps that is why the legend became so elaborate. History gave people a royal king, an unhappy marriage, a beautiful woman, and a death. Storytellers looked at this and apparently decided that what was missing was a maze. Naturally, the actual Henry II was much less romantic than the legend. He was energetic. He could be charming. He could also be terrifyingly temperamental. He had a remarkable ability to turn family disagreements into international political crises. His sons rebelled against him more than once. His relationship with Eleanor became so strained that he eventually had her confined for years. She would remain under varying degrees of royal supervision for much of the rest of his reign. And Henry continued ruling. His empire remained enormous. His marriage remained legally intact. His relationship with Rosamund eventually ended with her death. But the emotional consequences of Henry's family life did not disappear. His children would continue fighting among themselves. His sons would challenge him. And the dynasty would continue producing kings whose love lives were just as complicated. So perhaps Henry is a useful place to begin. Because he shows us the basic problem. A medieval king could have enormous power over other people's lives. But love was one area where power did not always make things simpler. Sometimes it made them much more complicated. And perhaps that is why these stories have survived. Not because medieval kings were particularly romantic. They usually weren't. But because underneath the crowns, the treaties, the heraldry, and the endless arguments over inheritance, they were still people. People who became jealous. People who became lonely. People who wanted affection. People who made poor decisions. People who sometimes loved the wrong person at the wrong time. And occasionally, people who were clever enough to realize that the person they loved could never occupy the place their kingdom required. That problem would appear again and again. Let's drift, then, a little farther across medieval Europe. Away from Henry's sprawling English and French territories. Away from Eleanor's court. And toward another royal household where marriage was treated less like a personal promise and more like a very expensive diplomatic document. Because if there was one thing medieval dynasties understood, it was that romance was lovely. But an heir with the correct grandmother was considerably more useful. And so, somewhere in another stone castle, another young prince was being prepared for a marriage he had not chosen. He would eventually become a king. He would eventually have a queen. And, naturally, he would eventually discover that having a queen did not necessarily prevent him from falling in love with someone else. The Middle Ages had many problems. They had famine. They had war. They had questionable plumbing. And they had kings who apparently needed to be reminded that marriage and romance were two different things. So, quietly, we'll follow the next one. There is no need to hurry. The castles will still be there. The kings will still be making mistakes. And the moon, presumably, has no opinion on any of it. The king, the queen, and the woman he could not marry. Let's drift a little farther now. Away from Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. Away from the complicated household at Woodstock. And toward the quieter, colder world of the northern courts. Because Henry's story was not unusual. The details were unusual, certainly. The maze was probably invented. The poison was almost certainly invented. But the basic problem was familiar. A king could marry for politics and love elsewhere. And sometimes, the person he loved could be someone the royal court had never intended to place beside him. This becomes especially interesting when we move into the later Middle Ages. By then, royal marriage had become an even more carefully managed business. A princess could be promised to a prince she had never met. A prince could be sent a portrait of a future bride. Sometimes the portrait was flattering. Sometimes it was less so. And sometimes, naturally, nobody cared. The important question was whether her father controlled a useful territory. Love could wait. Borders could not. One of the most famous examples of this problem came from England again. And this time, the king was Edward IV. Edward was handsome by medieval standards. At least, contemporary accounts describe him as unusually attractive. He was tall. He had a strong physical presence. He was charismatic. And he had the sort of personality that could make people follow him into dangerous situations. This was useful because Edward became king during the Wars of the Roses. England was being torn apart by competing branches of the royal family. Lancastrians and Yorkists spent decades arguing over who had the better claim to the throne. And, As is often the case with medieval politics, the argument was eventually settled by armies. Edward became king in 1461. He was still young. He had conquered the throne. He had powerful supporters. And he was expected to marry. This was not merely because people wanted the king to have a nice evening. A queen meant alliances. Children meant succession. A foreign princess could strengthen diplomatic relations. A marriage could bring money, land, military support, or legitimacy. So Edward was expected to make a sensible choice. Perhaps a French princess. Perhaps a Burgundian princess. Perhaps someone from another major European dynasty. There were possibilities. There were negotiations. There were diplomatic expectations. And then Edward met Elizabeth Woodville. Elizabeth was not a princess. She was not the daughter of a powerful foreign king. She came from an English noble family. Her father, Richard Woodville, had been a knight who rose considerably through marriage and royal service. Her mother, Jacquetta of Luxembourg, had connections to the aristocracy. But Elizabeth herself was a widow. She had already been married to Sir John Grey. He had died fighting for the Lancastrian side. Elizabeth was therefore a widow with children. She was also considerably less politically useful to Edward than the foreign princesses being discussed around him. And yet Edward became interested in her. According to later tradition, Elizabeth approached the king to ask for the restoration of her late husband's lands for their children. Edward saw her. He became attracted to her. And sometime in 1464, they secretly married. This was not a small decision. It was an enormous political mistake. Or at least, that is how many of Edward's advisors viewed it. The king had married without properly consulting his council. He had chosen a woman from the English nobility rather than making a prestigious foreign alliance. And he had married her secretly, which was, perhaps, the medieval equivalent of announcing that you had purchased a house without telling anyone and then casually mentioning that it was actually a castle. Nobody was especially pleased. The marriage was eventually revealed. And then came the consequences. Elizabeth became queen. Her family suddenly found itself at the center of English political life. Her brothers and sisters received marriages, offices, titles, and opportunities. The Woodvilles rose rapidly. Very rapidly. And this created resentment. Edward had not simply chosen a wife. He had created an entire political faction around her. This is where love becomes difficult to separate from power. Was Edward genuinely in love with Elizabeth? Perhaps. There is evidence that he remained attached to her throughout their marriage. They had many children together. He seems to have trusted her. But Edward was also famous for having numerous mistresses. So even if his marriage began with genuine affection, his behavior did not exactly resemble a medieval version of exclusive devotion. One of his most famous mistresses was Jane Shore. Jane was born Elizabeth Lambert. She was the daughter of a London merchant. She married William Shore, a wealthy goldsmith. The marriage apparently did not work particularly well. William was older than she was, and later writers described Jane as attractive and charming. Eventually, she became associated with Edward IV, Jane Shore was not the only woman in Edward's life. There were others. Edward had a reputation for pursuing women, but Jane became particularly famous because she seems to have had genuine influence over him. Unlike many royal mistresses, she was not primarily remembered for greed. Later accounts portray her as generous and charitable. She reportedly used her influence to help people who came to the king seeking mercy. Now, we should be cautious here. Much of what we know about Jane comes from later sources. And later writers loved turning royal mistresses into moral characters. Either they were wicked temptresses, or they were secretly wonderful women misunderstood by history. There was rarely much room for the possibility that they were simply ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. Still, Jane's relationship with Edward seems to have been important. She was close to him. She was part of his court. And she survived him. That last detail matters. Because when Edward IV died in 1483, England entered another period of chaos. His son became Edward V, but the young king never really got to rule. He and his younger brother were placed in the Tower of London. Their uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, soon became King Richard III. The princes disappeared from public view, and Jane Shore found herself caught in the political aftermath. She had also been associated with powerful men. Richard III accused her of immoral behavior. She was arrested. She was forced to perform a public penance through London. The punishment was humiliating. She walked through the streets wearing only a simple garment, carrying a candle. People gathered to watch. And then, eventually, she was released. Her life after court was much quieter. She lived for years afterward and eventually died around 1527. Think about that for a moment. Jane Shore had been close to one of the most powerful kings in England. She had moved through royal chambers. She had known the king personally. She had seen political decisions being made. And then, after the king died, her world changed almost overnight. That was one of the dangers of royal love. The relationship might feel intimate, but the political environment around it could change very quickly. A king's affection could elevate a person. A king's death could remove that protection. And a new king might have very different feelings. Edward's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville also demonstrates something else. Medieval kings were not always simply trapped by politics. Sometimes they deliberately ignored political expectations. Edward knew what was expected of him. He chose differently, and the decision had consequences. This is important because it is easy to imagine medieval kings as prisoners of tradition. They were not. They could be stubborn. They could be impulsive. They could make romantic decisions. They could also make extraordinarily poor decisions. Edward's marriage was not necessarily poor because Elizabeth was a bad queen. In many respects, she was capable and politically active. The problem was the speed of her family's rise. The Woodvilles became too powerful too quickly. Other nobles felt threatened. And in a court already divided by years of civil war, resentment could become dangerous. Edward's personal choice, therefore, became a political problem. This is one of the recurring themes of royal romance. The king may think he is choosing a woman, everyone else sees him choosing an alliance, or rejecting one, or creating a faction, or changing the future succession. There is very little privacy at the top of a dynasty. Even the bedroom can become political. And perhaps that is why secret marriages appear so often in medieval history. The secrecy itself offered a brief illusion of freedom. For a few hours, perhaps. Maybe a few days. The king could be a man rather than a king. He could choose. He could say yes. He could marry the person standing in front of him. And then, eventually, somebody discovered it. And the council began having a very long conversation. Let's drift now toward another royal family. This time, we will leave England. We will cross the Channel and move into the French world. Because the French monarchy had its own collection of romantic disasters. And one of the strangest stories concerns a king whose marriage was not merely unhappy. It was complicated by a question that medieval people found particularly important. Was the marriage even valid? The king was Philip II of France. Philip was born in 1165. He became king in 1180, when he was still a teenager. His father, Louis VII, had been married to Eleanor of Aquitaine before their marriage was annulled. Eleanor then married Henry II of England. So Philip inherited a kingdom that was surrounded by powerful territories controlled by the Plantagenets. The French monarchy was not yet the enormous centralized state it would later become. Philip had to be careful. He needed allies. He needed heirs. And, naturally, he needed a wife. He married Isabel of Hainault. She was young. The marriage strengthened his political position. They had a son. But Isabel died in 1190. Philip needed another wife. This time, he chose Ingeborg of Denmark. She was the daughter of King Valdemar I of Denmark. The marriage took place in 1193. And almost immediately, something went wrong. Very wrong. Philip reportedly disliked Ingeborg intensely after the wedding. We do not know exactly why. Medieval sources offer various possibilities. Perhaps there was a personal incompatibility. Perhaps Philip simply found her unattractive. Perhaps there were political complications. Perhaps something happened during the wedding ceremony. Whatever the cause, Philip tried to separate himself from her. He sought an annulment. But Ingeborg refused to cooperate. And here is where the story becomes almost absurdly stubborn. Philip wanted the marriage ended. Ingeborg insisted that she was his legitimate wife. The church investigated. The marriage was disputed. Philip eventually married another woman, Agnes of Morania. The problem was that his first marriage had not been legally dissolved. So now Philip had a wife who said she was his queen. Another woman whom he considered his wife. And the church saying, rather firmly, that this was not how marriage worked. Philip attempted to persuade the papacy to accept his position. Pope Innocent III refused. Philip continued resisting. The Pope placed France under an interdict. This meant that religious services were restricted across the kingdom. The king was not pleased. Ingeborg remained queen in the eyes of the church. Agnes remained with Philip. and the entire situation became a prolonged royal marital dispute. Eventually, Philip was forced to separate from Agnes. She died in 1201. Philip and Ingeborg remained apart for years. But Ingeborg never surrendered her claim. She continued to insist that she was Philip's wife. Eventually, Philip reconciled with her. By then, many years had passed. Ingeborg had spent a remarkable portion of her life in an uncomfortable political limbo. She had been queen, then rejected, then isolated, then recognized again. Her story is not quite a love story in the traditional sense, but it tells us something important about medieval royal marriage. A queen could not simply be dismissed because the king had changed his mind. Marriage was a legal and religious institution. And once political interests, dynastic claims, and church or authority became involved, personal feelings could become almost irrelevant. Philip could dislike Ingeborg. He could refuse to live with her. He could prefer another woman. But he could not simply erase the marriage. Ingeborg's persistence was extraordinary. She waited. She appealed. She refused to disappear. And eventually, she won recognition. Perhaps not the romantic victory anyone had imagined, but a victory nonetheless. There is something almost soothing about the stubbornness of it. Philip wanted the matter to go away. Ingeborg essentially replied, no. And the matter did not go away. For decades. Which brings us to another interesting feature of medieval love. Sometimes the most powerful romantic figure in the story is not the king. Sometimes it is the person who refuses to accept the role the king has assigned to them. Ingeborg did not become the beloved queen in a great romance. She became something stranger. She became the woman who simply refused to stop being queen. And in a world where kings were accustomed to getting their way, that was quite an achievement. So let's leave Philip and Ingeborg for a little while. The French court can remain behind us. The candles can continue burning. The stone corridors can remain quiet. And we can move toward a different kind of royal relationship. One where the king actually seems to have loved his wife deeply. At least, according to the evidence we have. And yet even that marriage would become tangled in politics, succession, and the uncomfortable reality that royal families rarely leave anyone alone. Because sometimes the problem was not that a king loved another woman. Sometimes the problem was that he loved his wife. And someone else wanted the throne. Which, as we shall see, could be just as inconvenient. For now, though, let the French court grow distant. The arguments can soften. The royal letters can remain unopened. And somewhere in the darkness of a medieval palace, a queen who waited for recognition can finally rest. We will continue gently from there. The French court can disappear behind us now, along with Philip II and the very long argument over whether he was married to the woman he had actually married. It is a useful reminder that medieval romance was rarely allowed to remain private. A king could dislike his wife. A queen could refuse to disappear. A pope could become involved. And suddenly a marriage that had begun with a ceremony and a few witnesses could become an international dispute. But not every royal marriage was unhappy. Sometimes, kings really did seem to love their wives. And sometimes, Rather inconveniently, the political world around them refused to cooperate. One of the more interesting examples comes from England again. This time, we are going to meet Edward I. Edward was born in 1239. He became king in 1272, after the death of his father, Henry III. He was a very different personality from Edward IV. He was known as Edward Longshanks because he was unusually tall. He was also called the Hammer of the Scots, which sounds impressive. It also sounds like the sort of nickname you might receive after spending several decades making everybody north of the border extremely annoyed. Edward was a warrior king. He spent much of his reign campaigning. He fought in Wales. He fought in Scotland. He involved himself in European politics. He was constantly moving. And yet, despite this hard military image, his first marriage appears to have been deeply affectionate. His wife was Eleanor of Castile. She was the daughter of King Ferdinand III of Castile and Queen Joan of Ponthieu. Edward and Eleanor married in 1254. Edward was about 15. Eleanor was also young. Their marriage had political advantages. It strengthened Edward's connections with Castile. It was useful diplomatically. But over time, the marriage seems to have developed into something much more personal. Edward and Eleanor traveled together. This was unusual in a certain sense. Royal couples often spent long periods apart. Kings were frequently campaigning. Queens might remain in another residence. But Edward and Eleanor were often together. She accompanied him during his travels. She was with him during parts of his military campaigns. And eventually, their relationship became one of the better-known examples of medieval royal companionship. They had a large number of children. Not all survived. And this was normal for medieval royal families. Child mortality was high. Even wealthy families could not protect children from disease. Royal blood did not make a child immune to illness. It merely meant the family had more servants available to panic around the bed. Edward and Eleanor's surviving children included several daughters and their son Edward, who became Edward II. Their marriage lasted for more than 30 years. And then, in 1290, Eleanor died. She had been traveling with Edward in Lincolnshire. She became seriously ill. She died at Harby. Edward was devastated. He ordered memorial crosses to be erected at the places where her funeral procession stopped on its journey toward Westminster. These became known as the Eleanor crosses. Only a few survive today. But the original plan was extensive. Each cross marked a stage in the journey of Eleanor's body. The most famous surviving examples include the cross at Jedington. Another stands at Hardingstone near Northampton. Another at Waltham. And the original cross at Charing Cross gave its name to the famous London location. Think about that. A king who spent decades fighting wars, ruling territories, and crushing rebellions commissioned a series of monuments to mark the journey of his dead wife. There is something unexpectedly tender about it. Edward was not known for being gentle. He was a hard ruler. His campaigns in Wales were brutal. His wars in Scotland were relentless. But his grief for Eleanor appears to have been sincere. The Eleanor crosses are therefore among the most tangible surviving reminders that medieval kings could have genuine emotional attachments. Not every marriage was merely a contract. Not every queen was simply a political tool. Sometimes the political arrangement became a real partnership. Of course, even this marriage had its complications. Eleanor was not a completely passive figure. She had political interests. She was involved in financial matters. She acquired properties. She participated in the management of estates. She had influence at court. And Edward relied on her in various ways. This was not a modern marriage. They were still king and queen. The hierarchy was obverse, but they seemed to have enjoyed each other's company. And that mattered, especially because Edward was away from home so often. When Eleanor died, Edward eventually remarried. His second wife was Margaret of France. She was the daughter of King Philip III of France. The marriage was politically useful. It helped improve relations between England and France. Margaret was much younger than Edward. He was in his 60s. She was about 17. So there was a considerable age difference. Their relationship was very different from Edward's first marriage. Yet contemporary evidence suggests that Edward was fond of Margaret. They had 3 children, and Margaret became known as their Pearl of France. But the memory of Eleanor remained. Edward died in 1307. He was buried beside Eleanor at Westminster Abbey. Their tombs were placed near each other. And so, after all the wars and political struggles, they ended up together. At least physically. History has a way of arranging endings more neatly than life usually does. Let's drift now to another royal marriage. One that begins with politics but becomes famous for affection. This time, we are going to France, and we will meet Louis IX. Louis was born in 1214. He became King of France in 1226. He was only 12 years old. His mother, Blanche of Castile, acted as regent. Blanche was one of the most capable political women of medieval Europe. She governed for her young son. She dealt with rebellious nobles. She managed alliances. She defended the monarchy. And she had very clear ideas about the sort of woman Louis should marry. The chosen bride was Margaret of Provence. Margaret was the daughter of Raymond Berengar IV, Count of Provence. She was young. She was well connected. And the marriage strengthened the French monarchy's position in southern France. Louis and Margaret married in 1234. The marriage appears to have been successful. They had 11 children. Louis was deeply religious. He followed strict personal habits. He fasted. He prayed. He went on crusade. He tried to live according to an ideal of Christian kingship. Margaret, meanwhile, had a strong personality. She was politically intelligent. She understood court politics. And she did not always agree with Louis's mother. This created tension. Because Blanche did not simply disappear after Louis married. She remained influential. Very influential. And Margaret had to live with a mother-in-law who had once ruled France and had no particular intention of becoming irrelevant. It was a difficult arrangement. Blanche apparently kept a close eye on the royal couple. She sometimes separated Louis and Margaret. The king's mother wanted to maintain her influence. Margaret wanted more independence. And Louis found himself caught between the two. Yet the marriage endured. Margaret and Louis had children. They traveled together. And when Louis went on crusade, Margaret accompanied him. In 1248, Louis departed on the Seventh Crusade. The expedition was disastrous. The French army reached Egypt. They captured Damietta. Then they attempted to advance inland. Disease spread. Supplies became difficult. The army eventually suffered a catastrophic defeat. Louis was captured. And Margaret, who was pregnant at the time, found herself in a remarkably difficult situation. She was in Damietta. Her husband was a prisoner. The French army was weakened. The city was vulnerable. Margaret negotiated. She helped arrange the payment of ransom. She also played a role in securing the release of French prisoners. The details are complicated, but the broader point is clear. She was not merely waiting in a tent for someone else to solve the problem. She acted. She had to. Her husband was gone. The crusade was collapsing. And the Queen had to keep the remaining French position functioning. Eventually, Louis was released. He then spent several years in the Holy Land before returning to France. Margaret remained an important figure in his life. Their marriage continued. Louis later went on another crusade. In 1270, he traveled to Tunis. There he died from illness. Margaret remained in France. She never remarried. The marriage had lasted more than 30 years. And while medieval sources are often idealized when describing saintly kings, Louis and Margaret's relationship appears to have been genuine enough to leave a strong historical impression. Yet there is another side to this story. Louis was canonized as a saint. His reputation became enormous. He was remembered as a model Christian king. But his wife had to live within the difficult structure of his religious idealism. Louis was not a romantic hero in the modern sense. He was deeply committed to religious duties. His life was governed by prayer, penance, and the responsibilities he believed came with kingship. So Margaret's marriage was not simply a private love story. It was a partnership within a highly controlled royal world. And this is perhaps worth remembering when we imagine medieval romance. People could love each other, but they did not stop being medieval people. They still lived according to expectations about religion, inheritance, gender, duty, and family. Love existed inside those structures. It did not necessarily replace them. Let's move on. Because if Louis and Margaret show us a marriage that seems to have endured, another royal couple shows us something rather different. They loved each other. They were famous. They became almost legendary. And yet their relationship eventually became one of the great disasters of medieval politics. Their names were Peter and Inês. The setting was Portugal. Peter was the heir to the Portuguese throne. He was born in 1320. His father was King Afonso IV. Peter was expected to marry someone suitable, and eventually he did. He married Constance Manuel of Castile. The marriage was politically useful. Constance was the daughter of the powerful Castilian nobleman Juan Manuel. It strengthened diplomatic connections. It was exactly the sort of marriage expected of a prince. But then Peter fell in love with one of Constance's attendants. Her name was Inês de Castro. Inês came from a noble Galician family. She was beautiful, according to later accounts. She was also politically connected, and she became very close to Peter. The relationship continued for years. They had children together. Peter's wife, Constance, died in 1345. After her death, Peter wanted to marry Inês. His father opposed the idea, and now the problem became political. Inés's family had connections to Castile. Afonso feared that Peter's relationship with the Castro family could bring Castilian influence into Portugal. He also feared that Inés's children might eventually threaten the succession of Peter's legitimate son. The situation became tense. Peter refused to abandon Inês. The king became increasingly concerned. Eventually, in 1355, Afonso IV ordered Inés's execution. She was killed at Coimbra. Peter was devastated. He rebelled against his father. The conflict eventually ended. Peter became king in 1357. And then the story became legend. Peter claimed that he had secretly married Inês before her death. He declared her queen after the fact. He had her body exhumed. According to later tradition, he placed her on the throne and forced nobles to recognize her as queen. The famous phrase attached to the story is that she was a queen after death. It is a beautiful story. It is also difficult to verify in its most dramatic details. Historians continue to debate exactly what happened. But Peter certainly remained devoted to Inés's memory. He commissioned magnificent tombs for himself and Inés at the monastery of Alcabacer. Their tombs were placed facing one another. The idea was that on the day of resurrection, they would rise and see each other first. That is one of those medieval gestures that manages to be both deeply romantic and slightly unsettling. The king could not marry the woman he loved while she was alive. So after her death, he created a monument insisting that their love was permanent. The story became one of Portugal's great tragic romances. But underneath the legend is something more familiar. A prince fell in love with someone his family considered politically dangerous. His father tried to stop the relationship. The relationship survived. Then violence ended it. And the prince never really accepted the loss. It is the same basic conflict we have seen before. Love against dynasty. Personal desire against political calculation. The individual against the family. And medieval royal families were extremely good at reminding individuals that they were part of something larger. A prince was not simply a man. He was a future king. A queen was not simply a woman. She was the mother of heirs, the daughter of another dynasty, and potentially the source of territorial claims. Even affection could become political. Even grief could become political. Even a tomb could become political. Somehow, the human part remains. Peter loved Inês. Whether every detail of the later legend is true or not, the emotional core survived. Centuries later, people still remembered them. Perhaps because the story is so simple beneath all the politics. Two people wanted each other. The world around them said no. And the world around them eventually won. Let's let that story fade for a moment. The Portuguese hills can become quiet. The monastery can become still. The stone tombs can remain in the darkness. And we can move toward another royal relationship. One where the king was not merely dealing with an unsuitable lover. He was dealing with a woman who had become politically powerful enough to challenge the entire royal system. Because sometimes a king's greatest romantic problem was not another woman. It was his wife. And sometimes the wife was more formidable than anyone had expected. We have already met Eleanor of Aquitaine. But her story is far from finished. She had been married to Louis VII of France. That marriage had failed. She then married Henry II of England. That marriage produced children, wealth, and eventually a family rebellion. Eleanor supported her sons against Henry. She was captured. She was imprisoned. And yet she survived. When Henry died in 1189, Eleanor emerged from confinement. She was already in her 60s, an age at which many medieval people would have considered a quieter life entirely reasonable. Eleanor apparently disagreed. Her son Richard became king. Richard would become famous as the Lionheart. He spent much of his reign away from England. He went on crusade. He fought in France. He was captured on his return. And Eleanor spent much of this period working to protect his interests. She negotiated. She traveled. She raised money. She defended the succession. She acted as a political force in her own right. This is where the story of royal love becomes almost secondary. Because sometimes the most important relationship in a royal family was between a mother and her son. Eleanor loved Richard. She supported him. And Richard, in turn, trusted her. But their relationship existed within the same world of dynasty and obligation. Richard himself married Berengaria of Navarre. The marriage was politically useful. Berengaria was the daughter of King Sancho VI of Navarre. The marriage strengthened Richard's position in the Iberian Peninsula. But the couple spent very little time together. Richard went on crusade. Berengaria accompanied him for part of the journey. They were married in Cyprus in 1191. But they had no children. Their marriage remained largely distant. Richard's emotional life is difficult to reconstruct. He had relationships with men and women, according to various sources, though historians debate the nature of some of those relationships. What is clear is that his marriage to Berengaria was not a conventional domestic partnership. She was queen. He was so, as we settle deeper into the story, a pattern begins to emerge. The people we call medieval kings were not always free to live ordinary romantic lives. They were surrounded by expectations. Their marriages were public. Their children were political. Their lovers could become political. Their divorces could become international crises. Their grief could become monuments. And their mistakes could affect entire kingdoms. Yet they still fell in love. They still became jealous. They still missed people. They still wrote letters. They still waited. They still made foolish choices. Perhaps that is the quiet irony at the center of all of this. The crown gave a king enormous power, but it did not make him particularly good at love. In fact, it often made love more difficult. Because when everyone around you has a reason to care about whom you marry, whom you love, and whom you produce children with, your private life stops being private. And maybe that is why some of the most enduring medieval love stories are not the happy ones. They are the stories of people who wanted something they could not have. A queen who refused to disappear. A mistress who became a legend. A prince who loved the wrong woman. A king who mourned his wife so deeply that he built monuments along the road her body traveled. None of these stories fit neatly into the idea of medieval romance. And perhaps that is what makes them interesting. So, for tonight, we will leave the castles quiet. The royal halls can empty. The candles can burn lower. And the arguments over marriage, inheritance, and legitimacy can drift into the background. But there are still many more kings waiting. Some will have mistresses. Some will have arranged marriages. Some will marry for territory and discover affection afterward. Some will love women their families hate. And some will discover that the person they trusted most was not a lover at all. It was a queen, a mother, a friend, or sometimes, unfortunately, a very ambitious cousin. And medieval cousins, as history repeatedly demonstrates, were rarely a source of peace. So let's drift toward the next court. There, another king is preparing for marriage. He has been told what kind of wife he needs. He has been shown the political advantages. He has been reminded of his duty. And somewhere, quietly, his heart is considering an entirely different woman. Naturally, because apparently even after several centuries of examples, medieval royalty remained determined to learn the same lesson repeatedly. Love is complicated. happiness. They became jealous. They made mistakes. And sometimes they loved someone very deeply. The difficulty was that a king rarely belonged entirely to himself. His marriage belonged to his kingdom. His children belonged to the dynasty. His friendships could become political alliances. His enemies could become family members through marriage. Even his grief could become a monument. That is why the love stories of medieval royalty can feel strangely familiar despite the enormous distance between their world and ours. The castles are different. The clothing is different. The language is different. The rules are different. But the emotions are not particularly strange. Someone wants someone else. Someone cannot have them. Someone is afraid of losing them. Someone makes a decision they later regret. Someone waits. Someone leaves. Someone stays. Someone remembers. And sometimes, someone builds a very expensive stone monument because apparently writing a heartfelt letter was not enough. Edward I built the Eleanor crosses. Peter of Portugal built the tomb of Inês. Other kings gave lands, jewels, houses, titles, and privileges to women they loved. Some relationships became legends. Others disappeared almost completely. And that is perhaps the saddest part. For every famous medieval romance, there were countless others that history never recorded. A king might have loved a woman whose name was never written down. A queen might have quietly cared for someone whose existence was considered too ordinary to mention. A servant might have spent years remembering a royal encounter that historians would never know about. History is selective. It remembers battles. It remembers treaties. It remembers births and deaths. It remembers kings who conquered countries. It remembers queens who changed dynasties. But affection is much harder to preserve. A feeling leaves very little evidence. Sometimes there is a letter. Sometimes a gift. Sometimes a tomb. Sometimes a chronicler mentions that a king was deeply saddened by a death. And sometimes there is nothing. Just silence. So perhaps the medieval kings we have met tonight should not be remembered only as foolish husbands or fortunate rulers. Henry II was a powerful king whose family eventually became almost impossible to control. Edward IV chose a wife for himself and created political trouble by doing so. Philip II discovered that a royal marriage could become a decades-long argument involving the church. Edward I appears to have genuinely loved Eleanor of Castile and mourned her with unusual devotion. Louis IX and Margaret of Provence endured the pressures of religion, family, crusade, and royal duty. Peter and Inês became symbols of love surviving beyond death. And Eleanor of Aquitaine reminds us that sometimes the most powerful woman in a royal household was not the woman waiting quietly beside the king. would be fewer stories. So tonight, as we leave the medieval courts behind, imagine the old castles becoming quiet. The servants have gone to sleep. The guards are standing along the walls. The horses are resting in the stables. The royal kitchens are finally silent. The king is no longer arguing with his council. The queen has put aside her correspondence. The chronicler has closed his book. And for a few peaceful hours, nobody is worrying about inheritance. Nobody is negotiating a marriage. Nobody is calculating which princess would make the best alliance. Nobody is wondering whether the Pope will approve the king's latest decision. Nobody is building another castle. And nobody is starting another war because somebody married the wrong person. For once, medieval royalty can simply sleep. And perhaps, underneath all the titles and ceremony, that is what they wanted too. Not always power. Not always conquest. Sometimes simply companionship. Someone familiar sitting nearby. Someone to talk to after the court had gone quiet. Someone who knew the person beneath the crown. Of course, they did not always find it. And when they did, it was not always enough to overcome the world around them. But sometimes it was. Sometimes two people managed to build a life together despite the politics. Sometimes marriage became more than an alliance. Sometimes affection survived long enough to become memory. And sometimes memory survived long enough to become history. So as you settle in tonight, perhaps let the old stories become softer. The castles are no longer imposing. The crowns are no longer heavy. The arguments are distant. The names are becoming quieter. Henry, Eleanor, Edward, Elizabeth, Philip, Ingeborg, Louis, Margaret, Peter, Inês. All of them lived their complicated lives. They made their decisions. They loved. They lost. They continued. And eventually, they became names in books. We often think of history as something enormous. Wars, empires, dynasties, centuries. But history is also made from small things. A glance across